Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Ellensburg, Washington, USA, home of Central Washington University. I'm your host, Nick Zentner. The local time is 8:47 on a Sunday morning, and today's date is Sunday, January 7th, 2024. Thank you so much for tuning in and remembering to join us live. We have almost 300 live, and we are 5x5, and I'm happy to see that. And yes, if you're watching this in replay, you can scrub ahead 12 minutes or even a little bit more, perhaps. There'll be a chapter title where the actual lecture begins. But in these first 10 minutes or 12 minutes, we'll be talking to folks live, just settling in and still making sure that we're doing okay. We're still 5x5. Terrific. Okay. Well, maybe we will not have, I'm not even going to say it. If we're 5x5, we're 5x5. And I've got a different shirt because I'm convinced now that my favorite black flannel shirt on top of a white shirt was creating some static problems. So that's my hypothesis lately. Okay, where are you viewing from? We'll go with these regular, just thick shirts, and maybe that will solve our microphone problems. Liberty Lake, that's Google Earth by Glenn. Hey, man. Glenn, Jim O'Connor's been using your stuff and sharing it with the USGS community. It's just great stuff. Moses Lake, I need to remember to email our guest, speaking of which. Tacoma, Washington, Kent, Washington, Bill from Portland, Netherlands, Glasgow, Scotland, Sheffield, UK, Namibia. Line in the Sand says, good evening from Windhoek, Namibia. Hey, Africa, how's it going? North America reporting here. That's a thrill. Nice to see you. Thank you for tuning in. Ithaca, New York, Goldendale, Washington, Washington from Russia. Hello from Russia. This is North America. This is extra exotic here this morning. Love it. Thank you. Tucson, Arizona. That's Elaine. Athens, Georgia. Naco, Arizona. That's Stephen. Pensacola, Florida. Pat has no sound, but I think most of you do. Swedenkirk and Valentina. Eugene, Oregon. Christchurch, New Zealand. Okay, wonderful. Are we 5x5? Is it just Pat and Yakima that's having troubles? One more time. You can hear me just fine? Okay, thanks. Let me email the guest, and then we'll just continue visiting. Where's the doc? Add the guest. Give me just a sec, please. Copy the link. O'Connor. Link for Sunday. From my Gmail account, away it goes to Portland, Oregon, and Jim O'Connor. Fingers crossed that works out okay. We've got more than 450. I got you on the iPad here. Let's do a few more hellos. Tallahassee, Florida, Long Beach, California, Troutdale, Oregon, Pat from Natchez, Washington. Thank you, Pat. Selah, Washington, Redmond, Washington, Ottawa, Canada, former home of the Champlain Sea. Thank you, Dennis. Bitterroot, Montana, Phoenix, Arizona, Frankfort, Kentucky, Milwaukee, Oregon, not to be confused with Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Sitka, Alaska. Alberta Gary's with us. Chelmsford, England. Dean is in Spokane. Dean, special thanks for your help this week. And Dean will be featured on Thursday's show, this coming Thursday. Battleground, Washington, Lake Chelan. Garrett, the Dutch Night Owl from the Netherlands. Snohomish, Spokane Valley, Snohomish, Anaconda, Montana, and so on. I mean it. Thank you. Thank you for the live viewing. I think it would still be fun to do this if 100 people were here as opposed to 1,000 like we typically have. But just to have a full room, quote unquote, online with the live viewers is especially meaningful because we're doing 2 of these shows a week. Each of the show is 2 hours long, so it's easy to get behind. We did a Friday noon live stream with a guest lecture, and I don't know, some of you may have caught me talking to Jordan Carey, guy that I work with who loves these programs. He's like 5 letters behind. He's been away for Christmas with his wife, Hannah Shamloo, his partner, Hannah Shamloo, his spouse, spouse, right. And, it's not a trivial matter to get caught up if you get behind. So the fact that you guys are on top of this is extra meaningful. Thank you. Speaking of which, I'm down to 1 camera because the corner cam I'm now just keeping down in the auditorium because we're back to our Friday noon lecture series. I'll just keep that down there. So this is a decent shot anyway. Obviously no snow, but I think snow's on the way. I'll believe it that's what Liz always says. I'll believe it when I see it. She's all excited to go skiing, cross-country skiing around the valley, but she's like, I'm not going to get my hopes up. They always have a winter storm warning, and then there's like 1/2 inch of snow. That's our drill. This is us today. And Thursday, what month is this? Thank you. Thursday, January 11th will be our next show at noon Pacific. Yep. Okay. One more thing. I've mentioned this before, but there are these programs called Nick on the Rocks. And I made 8 new episodes of this Nick on the Rocks program on PBS. Oh, we have Jim on. Jim, can you hear me okay? Okay, wonderful. Jim O'Connor's in the green room. We're good. Sitting kind of in the dark there in the back, but we'll get him nice, perfectly lit here. But that's a relief that Jim's in the green room, ready to go. Okay, so back to what I was just mentioning. I don't do this much, but these are available online. I think I forgot to put the most recent episode on. Yeah, one just aired on Thursday night from, we did an episode on the Shucks and Green Schist up by Mount Baker. This show I'm particularly proud of, Moses Cooley, tied to the Ice Age floods. So you can click on this if you go to nickzentner.com and you can watch it for free. You don't have to subscribe to PBS or whatever. So they have a YouTube channel that's barely viewed, but the episodes are available on YouTube through many ways, but this is one way to go. I mention all this because I think there's 2 of the 8 episodes that are particularly good. The Moses Cooley one, and then the one that's going to be airing this Thursday night, Mount Baker Volcano. And through the help of Backcountry Gary Paul, and Gary might be with us live, Gary came through in such a huge way. He has a condo right at the base of Baker, next to the Wake and Bake Bakery, and Brady the kid, the videographer, and Gary and I, we just cranked out, we filmed 4 episodes basically in the same 3 days. And it was coordinated to hike up the Yellow Aster and do the Shuckson thing and different colored shirts, speaking of shirts and the whole thing. But I think that Baker one is outstanding. So I'm excited to have that one air. The others I think are fine, but Mount Baker and Moses Cooley are the 2 that stand out. And I haven't seen the last one, which is the Waterville Plateau and the erratics up at Jaeger Rock. I don't think Brady's even started editing that one, even though he's supposed to have it done in 2 weeks. He's kind of a last-minute guy. All right, so that's enough of the self-promotion. Let's more than 600 are with us live. We've got a few minutes before we start. Can I say hi to a few more of you, and then we will I need to take my walk and get ready here. Vancouver, Washington, Freddie Chavre of Maple Valley, Washington. Woke Ass Messiah is checking in from Eugene, Oregon. Good morning, Woke Ass. Sorry, Patrick. Penticton, BC, Canada. Cascade, Idaho, that's Jennifer. She's not in Boise, everybody. She's in Cascade. Anna's in Portugal. Anna, you've been a regular now. Thank you. Carlton, Oregon. Billings, Montana. I don't even want to ask, but I'm going to. Is there any static in the microphone? Can you type no static, please, if there's no static? I've been so gun shy with this frickin' mic lately. Why do I even ask that? No static. That's why. I just wanted to see that. Okay. Maybe it is this shirt. Portland, Oregon. Thank you. Okay. I got about 3 minutes. Jim, our guest, is in the green room. He's going to settle in and get comfortable. And Jim, if you wanted to share your screen and have that ready as well, that can be put into the green room as well, even at this point. But it's your call whether you want to do that or not. For everybody else, let me toast you early. Here's a toast to you for joining us live on Sunday morning, January 7th. Here's to you. We'll start in 2 minutes. Hot mic. Okay, you're going to take your walk. You're going to do 15 minutes fast-paced. That's all you're going to do. Somebody's going to time you. 15 minutes fast-paced. You can do it. And then you go to gym. When we're done with gym, you can do this other stuff, but don't do more than 15 minutes. You hear me? You can do it. Hot mic. Hot mic. Well, a pleasant good morning to you all, and welcome to Ellensburg, Washington, USA, home of Central Washington University. I'm your host, Nick Zentner. What's the topic today, you ask? Columbia River Gorge. Do we have a guest? Sure we do. His name's Jim O'Connor, and he's in the green room right now. He's live. He's ready to come on. But I think I need 15 minutes to reframe some of our narratives that we've been working on in the past couple of episodes. I hope you've been watching these in order. Once you get behind, it's tough to get caught back up. But I know that many of you have been keeping up with the series. And the previous episode M, was in the Columbia River Gorge, but also talking about the mouth of the Columbia and over in the Chehalis and talking about these things called Satsep gravels. We'll touch on that today with Jim, I'm sure. But there's plenty of other things that we can do with Jim. And yes, I purposely did not hash everything out with Jim ahead of time, so we'll just go where we feel like going. And that's one of the reasons I want to spend this first 15 minutes doing this with you. Let's go to the document camera and just get it rolling, baby. So here's my plan. And you're like, you're not going to do this in 15 minutes. Are you kidding me? Yeah, I am. Watch me, okay? What happened to the Spokane ice sheet? Puget Lowland review, Chehalis, old Columbia pathways, ice rafted erratics, and then the submergence business of Brett's. Give me a chance. I can do it. All right. Somebody put me on the clock. 15 minutes or less. Let's go. Okay, let's start with what happened to the what the hell happened to the Spokane ice sheet? What do I mean? Well, it's something I've been playing with, and it's not my invention, of course. It's what Brett's was hammering in the 1920s, and we are this coming Thursday starting to get Brett's over to Spokane, and he's going to start exploring this area in eastern Washington. And in those papers, those famous papers in the 1920s, Brett's is talking about this Spokane ice sheet, and using Joel Gombiner's stage 6 number, we're coming up with a working number of 150,000 years ago. And Brett says, I got a bunch of water. I got a hellacious Spokane flood, one flood coming away from this Spokane ice sheet in eastern Washington. And where does that water go? It comes right down the Columbia River Gorge, the topic of today's episode. So one of the main things I want to talk about with Jim is there any evidence of this older than 100,000-year-old water coming through the gorge? Yes or no? And if there's yes, what might those deposits look like? And if there's no, does that mean we just need to get off of this entirely? Okay, that is the narrative since Brett's was hitting it so hard. This is the Okanagan lobe that comes in much, much later, just 20,000 years ago. If we go over to Western Washington, we have a more complete stratigraphy, I think in part because we don't have big ice age floods coming through and messing up the deposits, but that's just my take. But there's a nice symmetry between East and Western Washington, and sure enough, Brett's in 1913 and people before him had two advances of the ice, and he had the older ice getting larger and perhaps bigger. So again, our guest today might possibly try to talk us off of this, but since Brett's was talking about an older, bigger story, again, back to eastern Washington, Brett's is saying the major coulees are being carved in an older time. The big drama is happening older than 20,000 years ago. That's what I mean by this phrase of older, bigger, younger, smaller. I'm going to get off of wimpy, but smaller. And so does that narrative work if we poke around in the Columbia River Gorge? And we haven't poked around in the gorge much, but our guest has for the last 30 years plus. Okay, keep it going. Another way to show the same thing. And there's even a third batch of ice, at least, that's older yet, but I'm not really including that or hemming this hard. Probably after we're done with Jim, although if he's up for it, we can do it when we have Jim. I've got detail about Chamberlain, our friend T.C. Chamberlain in Puget Sound and the Willamette Valley in the fall of 1885. He didn't publish much. There's just a couple of sentences on an annual report, but I find it fascinating that Chamberlain himself, celebrating his 42nd birthday in Puget Lowland in 1885 is the first of our characters to get into Puget Sound. But as we've been discussing earlier in this alphabet, Sure, we got Russell and Willis publishing in 1897. We've got Brett's, of course, we've done this and other. Been plenty of other workers, but yes, I did that video this fall with Kathy Troost, where she published a PhD from the University of Washington. I want to use her work as well. This is a new way to portray what we've been kind of touching on. So it's trying to summarize Kathy's work, Brett's work in the Puget Lowland, and even Kelsey with her gravels in the Satsep that may or may not be tied to the Ice Age floods. So there's a lot on this. I may continue to draw this thing with Sharpie and keep changing it, but you know the stages now, marine isotope stages, and that gives us our best guesses for mega glaciations and therefore potentially mega floods, courtesy of Joel. The main story is here. And a younger story, which is not as dramatic, I guess. But what I'm showing with the little bubbles here are gravels, because we keep filling the valleys in Puget Lowland and south of Puget Lowland, like the Chehalis River Valley. And I don't know, can I get both of these on at the same time? So our color scheme comes through that might we have 3 different generations of glacial outwash dumping into the Chehalis River, which is on its way to Grays Harbor. This is all Ice Age stuff. But if we and Kelsey thought that our 150,000 year, our stage 6 gravels were the moderate level terraces in this flight of terraces. Do we have something like this in the Columbia River Gorge with today's guest? Or is it just way too energetic to preserve any terraces like this? I'll be curious to see where we can go with Jim with that. So, I mean, there's details thrown in about Brett's hammering the idea that when you have the ice, the crust is depressed, and then as soon as the ice is starting to retreat, we start filling that low crust with a bunch of gravels. And then during the intervening years, we uplift and scoop most of that shit out. Sorry, Patrick. And I don't know if that's the most accurate way to view this. This is all in the name of going back to Eastern Washington, of course, and trying to take this detailed story and seeing how much, if we believe in this, how much of the Western Washington glacial and flooding story do we believe and feel like we understand? How much of that story is complete? And then is it worth going over to Eastern Washington and looking for those same players? Maybe it's apples and oranges. But that's obviously what I'm trying to do with some of this. Okay. Then I forget my outline already, but the idea was, yeah, we've looked at this in 2 shows now, where the Chehalis and the Cowlitz, and Jim O'Connor is going to come to us live from Portland, Oregon in just a second, and here's the main Columbia. I think we were getting confused. I think you and I are getting confused, and I think Brett's was confused as well. The confusion is, where was the Columbia River flowing at different times in the past? Remember, we've toyed with this for 2 different episodes now. Did the Columbia River ever flow to Grays Harbor? And then did the Columbia River ever flow to Willapa Bay? And then the Columbia River is flowing here to Astoria today. Most of that is not an Ice Age story, I don't think. We'll go to Jim in a second. But those quartzite cobbles, the breadcrumbs that Brett's was following upstream and getting him to Eastern Washington because he was curious where these blonde quartzites were coming from, that's real, but I don't think that's an Ice Age story. And so this is new, but it might be helpful to you. If we go back to the Miocene, which is 16 million years ago, I think the story that so many of you are fascinated by, in the live chat from Thursday's show, you were all wanting to ask about the Columbia River pathway. Well, I think we can play with the Columbia going to Aberdeen or Raymond or Astoria or even down to Newport. I mean, the Ginkgo lava flow is getting down to Newport, Oregon. I think we can do that when the Cascade Range is lower. But that's not an Ice Age story, I don't think. I'll be asking. That's probably Jim. That's probably how we'll start. We'll start with this and have you shed some light on this. But I think by the time we get to younger than 3 million years, we have the Columbia River where we need it to be, and it's not going to be shifting again. That means that I think as far as the Ice Age story is concerned, and Brett's going upstream, I don't know if the quartzite cobbles are really helping him with an Ice Age narrative as he goes up the stream with his students, but instead it's these erratics that are up high on the walls of the Columbia Gorge, granites mostly, but some quartzites and some schists and some other frickin' weird rocks. These are the things that I think are really playing into the Columbia submerges idea. And so, give me just a sec. How am I doing on time? So yes, we will be in here today for sure. We might be going up to Eastern Washington where discussion with Jim. We might go downstream again. We might come back up here if you want. But I think it's this concept here that whether it's the 1917 paper by Merriam or others up in Eastern Washington, the White Bluffs, talking about, we got these funky rocks that are like strewn all over the hills, and we're taking careful note of their elevation. We realize we kind of have a high water mark in Eastern Washington. That's not a Columbia River gravel story. That's something else. And it becomes clear that's an Ice Age story. And that's ultimately what gets Brett's to thinking about this submergence. This is the last thing before we bring Jim in. And we got into some detail, but I don't think I hit it as hard as I needed to. Let me try it verbally with you. To summarize in 3 sentences or less from the last show, Brett's in 1919 with that paper says, we've got evidence. I've got evidence, J. Harlan Brett's, Condon in Western Oregon, Russell and Simons in Eastern Washington. We've got evidence of these high water marks from Astoria, Oregon, all the way up to Chelan, Washington. We've got terraces, we've got high water marks, we've got erratics all up on the hillsides. It's more than 3 sentences, of course. And Brett says, I think the water came from the west. I think it's Pacific Ocean water that is encroaching inland. I think Columbia submergence is what we're talking about. Nobody believes this anymore. Brett's didn't believe it 2 years later. But in 1919, he says this makes perfect sense to just raise sea level for whatever reason during the Ice Age and bring this water in, and it's all salt water. By 1921, although that's a major question, which we'll talk about with Jim, because we don't have the field notes yet, but definitely by 1922, Brett's is saying, never mind. I don't want to bring the water in from the west, and therefore I don't want it to be seawater coming in. This is all good evidence that we're underwater, but it's water coming from the north. It's fresh water. It's glacial water coming directly from the Spokane ice sheet. And then apparently later in Brett's life, he says, never mind, I guess I want the glacial water coming from Montana and glacial Lake Missoula. But that change of heart from water from the north versus water from the east is one of the main things we're exploring this winter. It's time to go to our guest, Jim O'Connor from Portland, Oregon. Let's see if this works, and we'll just go wherever Jim wants to go. Good morning, Jim O'Connor.
Good morning. Am I on?
You are 5 by 5, baby, and there's fireworks for you right there, right off the bat.
All right. Well, good morning to you and everybody else.
It's such a thrill to have you on. Thank you. We've got sun here in Eastern Washington this morning. Do you have sun down there?
Portland in January, sun. Not much.
Okay, that's stupid question number 1. Somebody needs to keep track of that. Okay. Would you mind, for starters, Jim, where did you do your schooling and how long have you been working at the USGS?
Okay. Well, I grew up in Seattle. I went to high school at one of the few high schools that in central Seattle that Brett's did not teach at, Garfield High School, and Garfield's claim to fame, of course, is Jimi Hendrix, Quincy Jones,
Yeah.
Roy Brandon, and Joel Gombiner.
Wow. Oh, you're coming out hot this morning. I love it.
You might think Joel and I were there at the same time, but not quite. I think Joel and I we discussed this, and I think I graduated exactly 30 years before Joel did in 1977. Then I went to University of Washington.
You did?
Got my undergraduate degree there and was influenced pretty strongly by Steve Porter, who's a quaternary geologist. I don't know if you've mentioned him in any of your programs, but he was interested in the Missoula floods. In fact, Richard Waite did his PhD with Steve Porter. And Steve Porter himself was a student of Richard Foster Flint, who I know you have mentioned. So there are some connections there. And so through field trips with Steve and other folks as well, I got interested in the Scablands as anybody does who goes out there and sees this terrain. And when I was applying to graduate schools, Steve suggested that maybe I consider going to University of Arizona, where Vic Baker had just started, because Steve knew of Vic's interest in the Scablan flooding. So I did both my master's and PhD at University of Arizona, and came up to Portland, started working for the survey in 1991. So I've been I had a little tortuous path, but I've been basically working for the survey since then.
That's a long time now. I mean, and you've devoted so much time to so many angles here, and it's not all Ice Age, I'm sure. So you have been working with those quartzite cobbles, I'm sure. And can you help us clarify that? Oh, you got them right there. Good.
Yeah, I got quite a few in my.
So what do you think of that idea that the Columbia River back 16 million years ago was flowing to different places along the coast?
Well, I think that's correct. I think the Columbia River basalts, those 16 million year old basalts, they're basically following the Columbia River as they come down to sea, and so those various basalt flows and the headlands made up of the Columbia River basalt are tracing the Columbia River, in the mid to late Miocene.
Mm-hmm.
And you can trace them that way, basically from about 16 million years to about 12 million years ago, which was the last of the Columbia River basalt flows that made it all the way out to the Pacific.
And is the Columbia at that time taking shortcuts across the Cascades, or are they all coming to Portland and then they're veering left and right?
Well, I think through the Cascades they were generally going through. The Cascades weren't as high back then, but there was a volcanic range there that was relatively high compared to the river corridor. And so the Columbia, basically at the time the Columbia River basalt flows, was confined between a latitude of about where it is now in the north in the Columbia River Gorge and Mount Hood to the south. So it was kind of confined into that belt, and basically coming into the Willamette Valley in that latitude range. So about a 40 or 50 mile belt, sort of what's been called the trans-arc lowland by some folks through the Cascades.
Okay, well, a number of things to say there. First of all, you're doing a great job. You're always so fun to talk to. It's so easy to talk to you. So let's just keep it going. This is great. Number two, there's 4 viewers. There's 4 major papers by Jim waiting for you. I'll show them to you when we're done with Jim, but he's got 4 substantial papers that he's written in the last 20 years that will give you all sorts of depth that you perhaps are unaware of, including a field trip that was just published a couple of years ago. Third comment to you, Jim, if you feel like you want to bring in that Google Maps and do it at any point now or later, feel free to just bring it in whenever you feel like it. And number 4, we're on to the next thought, unless you want to say something right now. But am I right then that the quartzite cobbles are not really an Ice Age story? Like, why would you spend time with these cobbles if you are working on Ice Age problems?
Yeah, well, I don't think Bretz was originally thinking about Ice Age problems when he first came down to the gorge, which I think was in either 1914, 1915. He spent several weeks in 1915 in the gorge, and he was working. 50. Yeah. Working with Ira Allison, who was working on well, you mentioned this in one of your shows, the first roadside guide, basically, to the geology of the Columbia River Gorge. And Bretz was, as part of that work, was focused on tracing what he called the Satsep gravels that were marked by these quartz sites. And he knew that they were from the work up in the Chehalis Valley. These were quite old, perhaps Miocene, because they were sitting on older rocks, and they were pretty darn weathered. And so he was basically tracing these up the gorge and beyond, and it's evident. And what's kind of funny is our group, and we're spent our main area of work right now is making geologic maps of the Columbia River Gorge. We're doing the same thing. We're tracing these I call them the golden quartzites. We've been tracing these east through the gorge, and they are marking a Columbia River route that precedes the Ice Age. Yeah, we don't really know exactly what the timing is, but they're associated with the last of the Columbia River basalt flows. So 10 to 12 million years. And I think what we're thinking now is they actually may be tracing a Columbia River route that persisted for much longer and is perhaps associated with the Ringgold Formation in Pasco Basin. So perhaps on the order as young as 3 or 4 million years. Okay,
so it's almost like it's good, but it's also bad that we're talking about these golden quartzites. The good part is you're working on it right now, so we're highlighting your work, and that's what's been on your mind, and you're mapping them now, so that's good. It's also, as you say, a reason that Brett's finally got up to Eastern Washington, because he's following these breadcrumbs up the gorge. The bad part is it's muddying the waters here with our story of the Ice Age floods, and it's a distraction almost. So viewers, we're going to do plenty of live Q&A with Jim, and I know that some of you will want to ask about the Columbia River, but please remember that maybe I'm hitting it too hard, Jim, I don't know, but those quartzite cobbles are not going to be a big part of what we do the rest of the series, because we'll be firmly younger than 3 million years for the rest of the winter, essentially.
So what I'd say though is as he is tracing what he called the Satsep gravels and what we now call, at least in Western Washington, Oregon, the Troutdale Formation. He was noticing these granite clasts, these what we now call the ice rafted erratics, and paying pretty careful attention to them as he was working his way east and tracking their elevations.
Yes.
And then also noticing some of the younger gravels too as he went, like the big sheet of gravel that fills the Portland Basin. And so it was those observations that led to and coupled with this experience both in Chicago and Puget Sound, this idea of the subsidence.
Okay.
And of course that was, in part triggered by Condon's Willamette Sound and Simon's Lake Lewis observations, both west and east of the Cascades.
This is fun. A slight detour. You love the history stuff. I don't know how many of your colleagues are deep into the history like you are. Do you feel like you're alone in this, or a bunch of people are digging through these old papers and old photos and everything?
I'm definitely not alone. I saw Sky's name scroll by in the chat, and no, Sky is interested in it. My advisor, Vic Baker at Arizona, is deeply into the history, and he's an encyclopedia. So I'm not alone, but I also have to say that what you and your viewers have come up with is going to keep folks like me awake at night for a long, long time. As I try to, there's a million rabbit holes to go down, and a lot of them are going to have rabbit stew in them. It's going to be. So yeah, it's. I mean, it just thanks to you and your viewers for. It's just overwhelming how much information you guys have brought to the table, and for me working in the gorge, I had no idea how much. I knew Brett's had been in there, but I had no inkling of how many places he went to. And I've been sharing this information with our mapping team, and we laugh because we've pretty much gone to hundreds of places that Brett's has already been to. Just
so why is he laughing? Is he laughing? He's surprised at how crazy places Brett's and his students are getting? Is that what you're saying?
Well, that's part of it. They were getting to some pretty amazing places, and one of my colleagues goes, he was a pipe smoker. How'd he climb up to these spots? But of course, he was in his 30s too, and that mitigates for a lot of vices, I suppose.
Cool. Well, thank you for that. Yeah, the viewer contribution continues to be just amazing, and we're just going to keep going with it. So, of course, the viewers are a big part of this. It's so cool that you're getting some use out of the work by Margaret in Spokane, for instance, who alerted us about the 1916 field notes by Brett's that were 4 blocks away from you in downtown Portland. Was that the first time you'd seen those papers, those notes?
Yeah, I spend a fair bit of time in that research library, and I didn't even think about looking for Brett's notes there, and now it's making me wonder, because the 1915 notes, I don't know if those are where those might be, but it's making me think I should see if there's more Ira Williams stuff that. So the viewers are interested in helping Ira Williams and any kind of field notes of his that you might be able to dig up. Those would be of huge interest.
Cool. One more thing about the kind of timeline thing, and then we'll go back to some geology. I'm going to try something, Jim. I'm going to hide you for just a sec. You okay with that? I'm just going to show the viewers a timeline. We'll come right back to you. Great job. So this looks similar to what I was doing before, and Jim's looking on right now so he can see this. But I spruced it up just a little bit more because I was getting more help. Ken in Sandpoint and a number of other emailers in the last couple of days. So orange, I'm staying with the color scheme that we had before. Orange is the Baraboo field course for his undergraduates at the University of Chicago. So he's got 10 students back in Wisconsin in the late summer of 17 and late summer of 18. Most of these are women, by the way, because it's World War I, and he's not coming out both of those years. This is one of the summers. I guess it's the second of two summers now that I'm just learning from Jim that Brett's is assisting Ira Williams as they're putting this Columbia River Gorge Highway together, that guide. But the reason I'm coming to this now, and we'll have Jim play off of it, is that in the next episode, this coming Thursday, January 11th, we're going to get to the quote-unquote start of the Brett story, which is normally the way it's told, where he gets off the train in Spokane in 1922. And by the way, he's doing that during the month of August with a few students. This is a peek ahead to this coming Thursday. But he's coming right back and doing another Baraboo class with a bumper crop of students. There's 19 students there. I don't think Brett's was doing Baraboo back in Wisconsin both times. You're like, why are you interrupting a conversation with Jim O'Connor with this Baraboo stuff? I'm not. I'm getting to this. We have the field notes here from the University of Chicago, and Brett's and his new crop of Chicago students, like the war is done. So they're coming out July 31st to September 21st. So I've realized that Baraboo was pushed up to earlier in the summer that year. That's, again, thanks to Ken, I believe, by email yesterday. But there's another field season, and this is really why I'm coming to this now. I need to get these field notes from the University of Chicago, hopefully before the end of January, before the end of this series, because this is the summer that Richard Foster Flint is a student of Brett's. And how much are they in Eastern Washington? It feels like Brett's and his students were in the gorge here, but they were also in Eastern Washington, as we learned by Google Earth from Glenn. And I think each of these summers, they're doing some gorge, but then they're following breadcrumbs and gorge and following breadcrumbs. And is this mostly Eastern Washington, I wonder, after they climb Adams with Flint? So that's the context for some of what we might be doing with Jim right now. I mean, I don't normally do that with the guest, but again, you have such a firm grasp of the history, far more than me and the viewers for sure. Does any of that timeline appeal to you? How much of that do you know, and how much it appeals to you as far as what we might be able to find with the viewers?
Yeah, a lot of this timeline information from the period of 1915 to 1922 is new to me. So I'm going to be very interested in hearing what you and the viewers can turn up from those summers. And the fact is that I haven't really gotten past the 1916 and 1919 notes yet, because there's just so much
same here
information in them.
Yeah.
Somewhere in one of those years, he talks about scabland, and so it sounds like perhaps he is starting to think about that in the late teens. And in 1916, he really didn't get too far into the scablands. He made it basically the Yakima, as he's tracing these golden quartzites, which is where we've traced him to as well. And in 1919, it seems like he was mostly in central and eastern Oregon and didn't really get up into the scablands
right
as well.
Right.
And so, and I'm looking, I'm a huge fan of Google Earth by Glenn, and in 2020 he's mostly in central Oregon. And let me just
hey, you want to share that? Can you share that?
I can try sharing it here. Yeah. I am a Luddite, so this could go really.
We're both behind the times. Come on.
All right.
Now let's bring it in. Yeah.
Okay, so this is Google Earth, and this is Google Earth by Glenn, I guess is how we refer to this, right? Right. And Glenn, this is amazing. This is such a service to science. Thank you. This is his. So in 1919, I guess he did get up into. This is all these points are his 1919 field stations as Glenn has located them. And
can you push in just a touch, Jim? I'm getting greedy now. Thank you.
All right. Yeah, so perfect. Okay. So just for some general orientation, here's the Columbia River Gorge. Here's Mount Hood, Mount Adams, Wallula Gap, Pasco Basin, right in here. And so in 1919, he spends a lot of time in the gorge. He's tracing these golden quartzites, these Miocene or Pliocene Columbia River gravels, up into the Yakima Valley. Nice exposure of them at Snipes Mountain. Mm-hmm. And then he actually makes it up into the Quincy Basin. I'm pulling out, moving.
Oh, shit. I didn't know that.
Yeah. So in 1920, he gets up to the lower Grand Coulee. Huh. And in my skimming of his notes for 1920, he tries to relate the gravel features that he sees along the Columbia here and in Grand Coulee to sort of the classic ice age outwash scenario that is the paradigm for what you see downstream of ice sheets. But I suspect, and it's just suspect that here he realizes that, okay, there's perhaps the story is a little bit different here, and that is what motivated his 1922. So I'm going to turn 1919 off and turn on 1922. So in 1922,
yeah,
he is into the Scabland area whole hog. So I wouldn't be surprised if it was what you were just looking at. I get confused. I wouldn't be surprised if it was the 1919 field work, and maybe whatever happened in 1921 that we don't know about that led him up there. So
let me pause you for just a sec. I never dreamt we'd use Google Earth by Glenn stuff while we had a guest on. So this is gravy. This is just wonderful. So I'm in the same boat. I just barely glanced at these. There's so much to absorb in those typed field notes, and then Glenn's stuff as well. But if I hide my, do you have a hunch? He knows what these gravels look like in the Puget Lowland, south of the ice margin. And he's got the feeling for the amount of valley fill, I guess, and elevations and other relationships that are quote unquote normal. do you have any sense at this point, before you've read all the details, about, is it really 1922 before he starts going, this is a whole different game? Or maybe there's a narrative here where 1919, 1920, and then maybe this mystical 1921, he's building more and more like there's too much gravel material here, or there's other features that just don't add up. What do you think?
Well, I mean, this is total speculation, but
Yeah.
but you mentioned in the previous broadcast that Brett's, if he has stated that if he could retract one paper, it'd be that 1919, submergence of the Columbia paper. And I think in that paper, there's some indications that he's uncomfortable with this submergence hypothesis, that and the source of that discomfort was the fact that the submergence was evident to, relative to present elevations, to about 400 feet above sea level west of the Cascades, but 1,200 feet above sea level east of the Cascades.
Oh.
and he explores in the paper, well, maybe there's some sort of hinging that's going on at the Cascades, or is it possible that there's glacial loading? And he recognizes that both of those explanations are pretty lame, and so there's something niggling him about that story. And so I think, it's often the way it works with us geologists. We kind of develop an idea and we go, that's not, that seems kind of weird. Let's, as we're moving along, keep our eyes open for other explanations. And I think that perhaps that niggle there is resulted in him sort of keeping his eyes open as he was looking at the glacial outwash story in eastern Washington.
Before we lose that thought, this is excellent. I'm just going to share it with you. I don't think you've seen it yet. The first page of his 1920 notes. So he's published the 1919 thing. I think it was published in like October of 1919. That's the submergence paper we just looked at in the last episode. And now he's ramping up for this 1920 season, which I'm going to hide you again for just a sec, Jim. You're a good sport here. So the timeline, God, this is fun. This is a blast. So as I mentioned in the last show, July 31st to September 21st, he's with 13 students. They're mostly in the gorge, I guess, but Jim just pointed out that at least a subset of them, maybe most of the undergrads go home, but he's got a few of the grad students and they get all the way up to the lower Grand Coulee. That's cool. But I've got the field notes from 20, at least most of them. And look at this. Brett's is out 2 full months. This is a record for him. Late June to late September. So he's not teaching Baraboo at all, apparently. And he's down to 10 students. But before I eat up more valuable time with Jim, here are the notes that Jim didn't know about, that Margaret in Spokane tipped us off to. Here's Brett's typing up notes to himself. Oh, no, sorry, that's something else. Forget it. I'm just going to try to read this with you, Jim, and then we'll bring you back in. Here's things I want to do in the summer of 1922. This is Brett's typing to himself, apparently before he even goes out. I want to see the relationship of the Horseheaven Hills and the Rattlesnake Folds of the Blue Mountains, and do it by a traverse between Pendleton, Oregon and Walla Walla, Washington. I want to deal with the andesite of the Columbia Valley at Goble. I want to deal with the Satsup folded in the Upper Cowlitz. That's Culver's locality. Yellow material in the cliff face of Fletcher Flat, blah, blah, blah. Hypothesis. This is what I want to get to. Is the Ringgold Formation due to a lava dam, either by Underwood lava or Carson lava? The Ringgold is pre-Columbia submergence, since the Burkett found granite boulders on the ring. This makes no sense to me, but it will our guest. And Condon's fossil-bearing terrace near the mouth of the Deschutes. Altitude of terraces of the fresh gravel at the Dalles and at Fall Bridge. Okay, I'm putting you on the spot, but like, I don't know, like you wanna try some of that? Does any of that work for you?
Yeah. That is in the stuff that's on your website, and I've seen it, and I can't remember exactly which set of notes that is from, and some of that is quite amazing and prescient, I think. As I mentioned, as part of our ongoing work of looking at the older Columbia River, pre-Ice Age Columbia River, we've been following Bretz's footsteps, tracing the Golden Quartzites into the Yakima Valley, and thinking about how that might relate to the Ringgold Formation and the shift of the Columbia River into its Woola Gap route.
Yeah.
And Bretz had determined by 1919 that there really wasn't much sign of the Columbia River east in the Dalles Basin and to the east towards Woola Gap. And this is an idea that we've been working on right now, with the idea that some sort of lava dam blockage, perhaps in the gorge, but perhaps related to the Simcoe volcanic field, which is on the eastern end of the gorge, might be responsible for both creating the Ringgold Formation as well as shifting the Columbia River through Woola Gap into its present course south of the Horse Heaven Hills. So Bretz has scooped us basically in that story. He points out different lava flows, but the other aspect of what you just put out there was trying to understand the relationship of these older gravels, what he calls the Satsop Formation, to the deformation, the uplift. And I think that's a really important point, because it's clear that the rivers traced by the Golden Quartzites have been uplifted thousands of feet. And Bretz documents that in the Satsop paper. The same diagram is shown in the Ira Williams 1916 book of these Pliocene, late Miocene, Pliocene gravels being uplifted, basically of 3,000 feet in the gorge. So
if we spend the rest of our conversation talking about the Ice Age and not pre-Ice Age stuff, and viewers, we're coming to you in 10, 15 minutes, and we'll just keep this conversation going if Jim has time. If we're younger than 3 million now and we're in the Ice Age, how much is uplift and clockwise rotation? Do we need to consider that much? Or are we so young with the Ice Age flood story? Even if we're going back 1 million years, how much is uplift factoring into our mental gymnastics?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm sorry I keep diverting to the Pliocene, but
this is great.
But there's a lot to say about the Quaternary too,
Yeah.
and this is the question of how much recent uplift there's been in the gorge is one that we've been thinking about for quite a while, both for the hazard aspects to it, but also in terms of understanding what the Missoula floods did and didn't do as they came through the gorge.
Mm-hmm.
From evidence of lava flows that have come into the Columbia River Gorge. We know that it was within a few feet of its present elevation a million years ago.
Really?
Yeah. I can, if you want, am I
Sure.
still sharing?
Yeah, I'll bring it in.
All right. Sharing on the fly here
Love it.
with O'Connor. This is a really dangerous thing.
You gotta love it.
All right. So I'm zooming in to the mouth of the Deschutes River, and the Deschutes River marks the eastern end of the Columbia River Gorge National Scenic Area. This is Miller Island.
Thank you.
This is a scabland channel on the north side that Brett's described, having cut through this the spur of basalt that sits detached from the flows to the north. But the very tip of this island right here, this teardrop shape here and this one here, it's a 900,000-year-old lava flow that came from up here at the crest of the Columbia Hills anticline. It's called Haystack Butte, and it sent lava flows to the north and the south, and one of them came right down here into the Columbia River. And we know it came into the Columbia River because it's been the basalt, the lava flow has been quarried out right here to for jetty to protect the freeway on the south. And at the base of the flow here are golden quartzites, Columbia River gravel, and this flow, as I said, is 900,000 years. These quartzites sit about 5 meters above. They sit within range of historic Columbia River flooding here. So basically that is pretty strong evidence that there has not been much incision of the Columbia River in the last 900,000 million years. And there's similar situations to that in the Central Gorge, where there's also young lava flows that have come down into the Columbia, marking where, at least the elevation of the river at that time.
So it's not like that. What was the date one more time? 900,000 or so?
Yeah.
It's not like that lava flow is flowing onto much older Ice Age flood gravels or a bar or something like that. If we're exploring these much older floods, that's not one place to look underneath that lava flow in the middle of the gorge, it sounds like.
No. So this is something that Brett's picked up on. The Columbia River outwash and sort of normal river deposits are chock full of these quartzites. But the flood gravels have very few quartzites. I mean, there's a few of them in there. They're usually broken. You'll find a few granitic class, but the flood gravels are almost entirely composed of basalt class, stuff that's been ripped up just upstream. There's really a profound difference. And Brett's recognized that when he looked at the Portland Delta gravels back in 1915.
Yeah.
And he knew there was something different about those. And that might be another thing that was niggling him as he worked his way east. So it's pretty, the gravels deposited by the floods are almost all basalt class or whatever else is local to the area. The floods were picking up and dumping. The river deposits, the Columbia River deposits, are basically the stuff that hangs together as it's being transported. And so as you go further and further down the system, the quartzites they're the hardest thing out there. So they become concentrated basically. And then also in the older deposits, the quartzites are the only things that don't turn to muck over millions of years, especially on the western wet side. But coming, if I may, coming to your point of older deposits, and this is something that's really interesting, and one of the reasons why it's been kind of fun and I think productive to work in the gorge. No, in the channeled scablands, it's a mess. It's a plexus of routes. There's older deposits, there's younger deposits. We don't really. We're starting to get a handle on the sequence of routes out there. There's controversies about where water came from, but you get to the Columbia River Gorge, all the floods came through there.
Want to come through right there?
Yeah, they had to. So and so it's been a good place to think about how big the floods were, in part because we know that the channel elevation, the valley floor elevation hasn't changed that much.
Okay. And
it's a good place to look for older deposits too, not right in the main part of the valley, because the last glacial floods were sweeping things out, but in the backwater areas and up the tributaries where you have the fine grain deposits and like in the channeled scabland, every back flooded tributary has these stacks of fine grain deposits from what was being carried in suspension, the sand and silt primarily. And that stuff, those floods. Am I sharing? I don't know.
Well, yeah. So viewers, I promise we're coming to you, and we'll go wherever you want to go with the most basic questions about the gorge to the most detail specific about one particular place. That's totally fine. But I think this next 10 minutes is the heart of what I was hoping to do with Jim. So I don't want to rush this part. We're going to share. And yeah, Jim, if I can steer you just a touch, like, can you take us to some of these protected side places that are ripe for older deposits? And I don't know how old is in your world, but like that's where I'd like to go. So you're sharing right now. Let's do that.
All right. So for example, here again is the Deschutes River coming in to Miller Island. You can find these fine grain flood deposits all the way up to Maupin, Shears Bridge, 50 miles up the Deschutes. You find them similar distance up the John Day River. This is the John Day River here. You find them up Rock Creek. You find them in the Dalles Basin where floods were kind of choked up behind the constrictions of the narrow part of the gorge downstream.
Yeah.
And there's a few places where you see these fine grain, rhythmically deposited beds. And I'm going to zoom into one right here.
Love it.
Okay, so, and if I was really adept, we could go to Google Earth, but I'm not that adept, and show you this road cut right here. And the top of the road cut is overlain by about 20 of these last glacial Missoula flood beds.
Okay.
And I see Sky asked if there's 40 in the gorge, and there's something like that. There's 40 in the Willamette Valley. But I think that 40 number is kind of a red herring, but there's dozens in the gorge. But what's interesting about this exposure here, and there's others like this, is that it sits on top of layers of windblown sand and silt, loess. So the sequence there is like 20 flood beds, and then about eight layers of loess, episodes of windblown deposition, and there's tephras in there and the lowermost list is paleomagnetically reversed. So basically, it's 1 million years of record in that road cut there, and the only flood deposits are the last glacial ones on top.
Huh.
And that's just one example of dozens of places that are like that. I mean, that's probably the best example, but the bottom line is nowhere in the gorge have we found, or in the Willamette Valley, have we found flood deposits that are older than the last glacial flood deposit.
Huh.
It's clear from the work that Vic Baker has done, that Bruce Bjornstad has done, that Sky Cooley has done, that Richard Waite has done, that there were older floods that came across the Scabland and down the Columbia Valley. But we see no sign of them in the gorge. And
Wow.
and so, I mean, that's a question that I think demands more work. And, you know, one possibility is that those earlier floods were smaller, but that's just one possibility.
Yeah.
Another element to that question is as far as I know, there's been no evidence of a pre-last glacial Lake Missoula. I mean, there's certainly other sources for floods, but in terms of producing a huge volume of water that could inundate the system all at once, you know, glacial Lake Missoula is kind of the star. And so I mean, there's a million questions to keep following up on, but one thing that's, I mean, I mean, the absence of evidence is not really necessarily strong evidence of absence, but there is no evidence that we've found so far with quite a bit of looking of older cataclysmic flood deposits in the gorge.
Just what I was hoping for. I mean, that's hitting it right on the head. And I'm immediately thinking about the timeline with Brett's again. So he's writing in 1923, both of those papers. Hey, we got a big Spokane flood that's pretty early compared to the Wisconsin flood, as he's talking about. And then 1924, he's back in the gorge. I don't know. I haven't read the details yet. And then it's not like he went down in the gorge and said, well, wait, we don't have these old deposits down the gorge. It's not like he backed off of it. He just kept going with that old Spokane flood even after he kept going back into the gorge. So it would seem like he would spend time in the gorge, get interested in the floods, go to the Channel Scablands, spend like 5 summers in a row in the 20s in the Scablands and saying, I've got the Spokane flood, and it finally culminates with the ambush meeting. But the narrative doesn't say that with these notes. He keeps going back into the gorge to connect the dots, and yet I don't know why does he keep going back into the gorge in the mid-20s, and why is he continuing to think about this old big flood, do you think? Does he just not keep a track of time with those deposits? Is it simple as that?
Well, yeah, I'm not sure I can totally answer that. I think he comes back to the gorge because now he has a different idea about what is causing the submergence of the Willamette Valley. And he goes back and he's focused on the younger deposits. And it's most classically described in his Bars of the Channeled Scabland papers, which is the best title ever for a paper. And he goes back through the gorge and with this flood hypothesis in mind, and beautifully describes the Scabland features, the bar features, the stratigraphy of the bars through the gorge and out into the Portland Basin, and essentially, without saying so, retracts his submergence
Right.
paper.
He never does officially
No.
retract that. Yeah.
No.
Okay.
So the question about, the Spokane glaciation and the Spokane flood, that one, I just have to speculate that, the early geologists that came out mapped this glaciation coming out into the northern channel scabline. I think largely inferring that these gravel deposits that they couldn't quite make sense of were some sort of glacial, were deposited directly by glaciers, and so that's one reason why the limits were drawn the way they did. And I'm not sure, Brett's kind of went with that for quite a while. And then there was also the relationship in Moses Coulee too, where you have a glacial drift till moraine sitting on top of flood deposits there, which made him think, okay, there was an episode of flooding that preceded the glacial maximum, which is the case there. But in Moses Coulee, as Joel and others have deciphered, that most of the flood features that we see in Moses Coulee are also, late Wisconsin as well. Yeah,
not just the flood features, but the cutting of the coulees themselves. Like that's. Viewers, I promise. Get your uppercase ready. I could go on forever, but like that is the general story, right? We're carving these coulees, and then late in the game, we're gently depositing these moraines and rhythmites in these cut things. But if we're trying to take that story and match it with what's in the gorge, even that really bombastic major excavation stuff, that's going to tie with those 20 beds you have at the Dalles, for instance.
Yeah. With the timing of the coulee cutting and how that relates to the last glacial flood history is something that I'm keenly interested in now. And basically, the story of the floods in the gorge has drawn me to the channel scablands to start thinking about how that landscape has evolved. I think it's pretty clear. We're going a little far afield now, but I think it's pretty clear that at least the lower part of Moses Coulee is a pre-last glacial feature. That coulee is huge. It's got drainages that grade to it. It was certainly cleaned out by the last glacial floods. The northern part of Moses Coulee, I'm not so sure about. And Grand Coulee, it's clear at the end of the period of flooding that there were small floods depositing sand and gravel in the bottom of a carved coulee. But when is it possible that the entirety of Grand Coulee was carved during the last glacial, presumably by early big floods in the last glacial period, though? And I think that's an open question. Others will say no, the coulee was there, but I think it's, for a few reasons, I think it's an open question. And
this is just so great. And we haven't even touched on the Bonneville flood, which was your PhD dissertation. So there's you have got your fingerprints over all this stuff, and we could go so many directions, but we're just going to, do you have another 15 minutes, Jim?
I got as long as you want.
Okay, thank you.
As long as the viewers will put up with me.
I'm sure there's a bunch of questions here. Viewers, we're coming to you. All caps, please. Get your caps lock on. And sounds like Jim can see the live chat as well, but I'll kind of moderate, I guess, unless something really catches your eye, Jim, and we'll just go wherever the viewers want to go here for the next 10, 15 minutes. They're all saying nice things about you. That's always nice to see. Oscar asks, how are flood deposits dated?
That's a good question. There's a few ways. One is by sort of the classic radiocarbon dating, and that's we've done some of that in the gorge. The other more recently is this cosmogenic exposure dating, in which folks like Joel and Isaac Larson and Andrea Balbos have done, where you're looking at granitic rocks that were either deposited by the flood or ice rafted, and there's a lot of targets, and you can date how long you can by cosmogenic dating you can specify when that boulder was emplaced there. There's luminescence dating, which people have used in the fine grain deposits to date when the last time the sediment saw light. And then there's tephras, these volcanic ash layers that have been widely dispersed across the scabland. And there's one tephra that's interbedded with the flood deposits from Mount St. Helens. That's about 16,000 years old. And then there's one tephra that sits above the flood deposits from Glacier Peak. That's about 13,500 years old. And so there's all these different approaches, and sometimes they're a bit conflicted and there's uncertainties, but I think taking all the evidence together, it's pretty clear that most of the flood deposits, except for the much older ones that have the strong soils on them, that most of the last glacial flood deposits date between about 20,000 and 14,000 years ago. Excellent. And the Bonneville flood was right in the middle of that, okay. 18,000.
Thank you. Excellent answer. Where was it? Jeff, could you please restate how many floods you have from your best road cuts in the gorge?
In the gorge, to probably in one spot, the most is 25 or 30 or so. I'd have to go back. In the Willamette Valley, there's one spot where there's 40 layers. But if you take all the sites together and you tie the stratigraphy together using the Mount St. Helens S tephra, which appears in a lot of these deposits, there's probably on the order of about 100 floods altogether.
And those 100 floods are all red. You're a red guy as far as evidence that you've got in the gorge. You've really got nothing from blue. If we're going back to stage 6, nothing in the gorge that you know of, just partly because of the limitation of the dating methods or whatever. We just don't go back that far.
Well, we have list layers that go back that far, and we have older non-flood deposits that go back that far, but no deposits which look like cataclysmic flood deposits.
Thank you. Let's go down to live. We'll grab a few more here. We'll just kind of go rapid fire. Rock Tapper Robin says, are there flood deposits from older floods downstream of the gorge? Oh, downstream of the gorge. Like, is it any different downstream of Portland?
It gets it's no, not that we've seen so far, but also a lot of the Quaternary history is buried downstream of Portland because sea level has risen 300 feet since, in ice ages, sea level is a lot lower. And so all the action is down low, and most of the, old stuff is been buried by Holocene or younger sediments. You can only trace Missoula flood features as far downstream as about Longview, where the river, the river is making this bend, heads north, and then it heads out to the Pacific. And once it starts heading out to the Pacific, all the flood deposits that were presumably in place are now buried underneath the fill that has accumulated as sea level has risen the 300 feet since the last ice age.
That's cool. I never thought about that before. Pat in Natchez wonders, do the quartzites found at different heights east and west of the Cascades correlate with tectonic data for the Cascade development? Quartzites found different elevations east and west of the Cascades.
That's an excellent question, and I guess the way I would address that is we're using, as among other things, we're using those quartzites and their elevations to help us understand the deformation of the Cascade Range, as well as Yakima fold belts. Because presumably the river at the time these quartzites are being emplaced is close to sea level or within a couple hundred feet of sea level.
Right.
Rivers are not going up and down over the Cascades or the Yakima folds. So these quartzite gravels provide an excellent datum for understanding post deposition deformation. And that's really one of the main motivations for us trying to figure out this golden quartzite story.
And yet we're pre-ice age with the quartzites. That's one of the biggest things I've learned from you this morning, that these major ice age flood deposits typically don't have much quartzite in them.
Yep.
Okay. Sky Cooley wonders, how about the source of the quartzites? Where is all that quartzite coming from? Is that clear?
Yeah, Sky. Hello, Sky. How are you doing? No, I mean, so last summer I took a few buckets of these quartzites to Central Idaho. There's a conference of folks that specialize in the belt rocks, which these quartzites some of them come from, and the belt rock folks said, well, they could be belt, but they could be something else. So it's hard. They come from the east. That's all I can say. They don't come from the Cascades.
Yeah.
But there's quartzites that come down the Snake drainage and the Columbia drainage. So you can't really distinguish between the Snake and the Columbia using these quartzites, but they come from the east.
Well, of course, I'm guilty of making narratives that are a little bit more straightforward. So when I did a lecture downtown a few years ago, I said, hey, man, you got the Addy quartzite, you got the Addy Tavern at Chewelah, Washington. It looks exactly like some of these blonde quartzites. It all came from there. But, yeah, it's not that clear. There's many potential sources. 3 more and we're done with Jim. Jim has come through with living color today. Les wonders, have you looked at Alkali Canyon south of Arlington?
Yes. You
want to share?
Am I sharing?
Yep.
Let's go to Alkali Canyon. So okay, so here's Arlington right here. Here's the Columbia, and here is Alkali Canyon right here, and it flows into Rock Creek, which then flows into the John Day River.
Okay. Oh, cool.
And the floods definitely swept over all of this area here. How much a role they played in carving this canyon, I don't know. I kind of am thinking that it's an older river route. And there are lots of gravels here. There are some flood deposits, but most of these are older gravels, probably equivalent in age to the golden quartzites, the Satsep gravels that Brett's were looking at, but they contain no quartzites though.
Huh.
So it's from a different river system, probably probably some combination of the Deschutes and John Day and Umatilla rivers that was coming into the Umatilla Basin downstream of Wallula Gap. So again, Alkali Canyon is right here. Wallula Gap is right here. So there was, prior to the Columbia coming in here, again, this is 5 million years ago,
Yeah.
there was a river where the Columbia is now, but it was basically draining the Blue Mountains here at this point.
Thank you. Two more. Doing great. Shelby wonders, is there a way to tell how much time elapses between each flood in the deposits?
That's a great question, and it's you can do that in the places where the floods were coming into these glacial lakes. Like, have you talked about Glacial Lake Columbia?
Not yet.
Yeah. Okay. So can we divert?
Sure.
All right. So I'm still sharing. Okay.
Yes, there you are.
So of course the Purcell Trench lobe, which is blocking Glacial Lake Missoula, was coming down here.
Yeah.
And the lake was up here. But there were also other lobes of ice that invaded from Canada. One came down the Okanagan lobe and made this beautiful moraine right here. And I know Joel and Jerome have spoken about that.
Mm-hmm.
Another one came down the Columbia River itself and blocked the Spokane River drainage. And in both of the, in these places where the Columbia was blocked, these lakes formed. And the Missoula floods would come into these lakes and deposit a thick layer of sand, sometimes thick, sometimes thin. And then between floods, you would just have this sort of background lake sedimentation going on. And these glacial lakes, these glacial lake sediments are often varved in that in the winter, there'll be dark fine grain layers. In the summer, light silty layers. And so sort of like counting tree rings, you can count these varves, although, they're not the perfect thing to count, but you can count them.
Yeah.
And folks have done the same thing in Glacial Lake Missoula itself. And from these varve counts, it's clear that there, between the larger floods, there were probably several decades, 50, maybe 100 years, between the later smaller floods, just a few years from the varves.
Yes. All right. Last question is mine, I think. Viewers, thank you for all of your participation, and we will continue to work on many of the questions that you have, viewers. Thank you. What future work can be done in the Columbia Gorge, potentially going to earlier flood events? If we go back to blue time or purple time, are there any places to go look if we are getting more and more confident that there are some of these older stories? Or has it been picked over clean by Scott Burns and his students and you and others? Like, You say these tributary canyons are key spots where we've got quiet water, but is there a chance we're missing some things, or it's been worked over pretty good in the gorge?
Well, I miss things all the time, so I'm never going to say no. There's nothing there,
Yeah.
but the 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 tributary canyons would be the the places to look. Unfortunately, the exposures aren't great. Some more work perhaps in the Alkali Canyon area where floods spread out. That might be a possible location to find older deposits. I think once you get downstream of the Cascade Range, the complications of sea level going up and down, and make things difficult. I will say there are older outwash deposits in the lower Columbia River Valley that do date to those. I can't remember what the colors were that from.
Blue, yeah.
From
stage 6.
Yeah, so stage 6 and 12 are probably. If I can put my screen up again.
Sure. Well, yeah, you got me interested here right at the end. What
Okay. All right.
Lower?
So here's Portland. This is the Portland Delta. I'm basically speaking to you from the top of the D there in Portland. And here's Mount Adams. That we'll hear about Flint and Brett's climbing Mount St. Helens. And this is the Lewis River coming down here.
Okay.
And it comes into the Columbia at Woodland. And during the ice ages, it had a large alpine glacier system that came down the valley. And in the last glacial, the maximum ice was about here.
Okay.
But in 6 and 12, the ice extent was much greater. And I think in 12, it came pretty close to actually blocking the Columbia down here. And the outwash from that ice certainly did impound the Columbia to some degree. So we do see some older glacial stuff in the west of the Cascades. But this is all related to alpine ice, not the big ice sheets that we've been talking about. And the ice sheets are beating to their own drummer, which is a little bit different and not totally understood in terms of how it relates to the big continental ice sheets.
Well, that's a huge point. Seems to me like bringing it all the way back to the beginning of our conversation. Yeah, Stephen Porter is in the Yakima Valley and he's in the Wenatchee Valley and icicle drainage, and he's got these different advances, multiple ice advances, whatever the phrase was, older, bigger, younger, smaller, with those two bodies of ice. That drainage you were just talking about. Apparently, Brett saw alpine ice coming down Hood River Valley, and the older advance is getting further than the younger advance. So that premise that I'm thinking about all this ice of different generations and different stages, but having the alpine ice not in total sync with the continental ice sheets, that's the going thought.
Yeah, and there's something strange about the Cordilleran ice sheet and the last glacial. For some reason, in the alpine ice, the last glacial was kind of puny compared to previous glaciations, 6, 12, 16. But in the Cordilleran ice sheet, which the Puget Sound, there's a smidgen of older stuff outbound of the last glacial Puget lobe.
Yeah.
But the Okanagan lobe, no older stuff outbound of it.
Yeah.
No the Purcell Trench Lobe, no evidence of older stuff, no evidence of a pre-last glacial Lake Missoula that I know about. But Sky might have more information on that now.
Yeah.
So there's something strange about the last glacial Cordilleran ice sheet.
Huh. Well, I think we're going to keep working on that theme and trying to correlate. We're not the first to think about this, of course. It's just the same old thing, just compiling other people's work, previous work, but going back a decade, going back a century even. But yeah, that's fascinating to me. Like, you wouldn't have the same general storylines with each alpine body versus ice sheet body east and west of the Cascades. Fascinating. Well, please, you want to say something else there?
No, I think I've probably said way too much already.
Oh, yeah, no, it's good. It's good. Jim O'Connor, I'm so grateful to you for your time today. I'm sure everybody's going to be saying wonderful things about you in the next 10 minutes. So please watch this replay so that you can soak all this love in. It feels great. And I can simply thank you for your time, and I don't know, possibly get you back on sometime before the end of the alphabet. This has been so good. So thank you, Jim.
Well, that'd be fun. I just want to repeat what I said earlier. What you guys have done is more than just showcase the science. You guys are seriously contributing to it by all the research that you are bringing to light. These notes are there's going to be a lot of rabbit stew that comes out of these notes.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that. Okay, Jim, have a good day. We'll see you down the road. Thank you so much. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Well, that was nice at the end there. Hope you enjoyed that conversation with Jim O'Connor. Sorry I didn't get to your question. You know about that. So many things coming in here like usual. I really enjoyed that. And there are some major things that I think happened in that last hour that we will continue to follow up on, whether it's the Brett's angle or the geology angle. So that was just great. Should we quit? Of course not. I've got a few things I want to share with you, but I do want to say one thing before I get into it. Of course, I'm grateful for all the viewer participation. We know that. Recently, in the last few days, I think is the first time I have realized that I cannot involve all these things coming in. I think to this point, I could take most of the emails, fashion some of the themes that are coming in, and then get it into our programs. But we're now talking about a record number of emails coming in daily, even more than normal. And it's great, of course, but there's stuff on World War I veterans that went to Baraboo with Brett's, and I can't use it. Going through research of individual students that decided to major in geology because they had Brett's, and then they went on to become a professor, but they never came out here to the Northwest. So what I'm trying to say is I'm grateful for all the emails, but there's an additional thing now. Instead of me just not being able to reply to each of you and saying thank you by email, now it's even like it's good stuff and I'm not going to be able to fit it in. So I'll give you a couple of examples of that right now. So I've got a few slides. I also have the papers by Jim. So before I forget that, let's do that first. So here is, let's start in case you're new. So nickzentner.com looks like this. We're clicking on the word floods always. Every episode, there are papers under the word floods. And for today's episode, episode N, I want to highlight a little bit from what Chamberlain wrote in 1866. There's a couple of letters that Brett wrote to G.K. Gilbert, who's a very famous name in geology, in 1916, basically right after he was helping Ira Williams with the roadside book in the Columbia River Gorge. If you care to look at some of the notes that Bretz was writing for himself as he was reading papers to get ready for the Columbia Submergence 1919 paper, that's there. I mean, I can show you. It's just like, this is in some of the University of Chicago stuff. The type is quite faint, but it's fascinating, I think, to have him taking notes as he's reading Russell and reading Willis and reading Joseph Pardee, who we will introduce in the next episode. And then 1, 2, 3, 4 papers by our guest today, Jim O'Connor. This most recent one from 2021, I believe Jim said that they put together a detailed geology field trip guide for the National GSA meeting that was held in Portland of 2021, but then they couldn't run the trip because of COVID or because there weren't enough people signing up for the trip because of COVID and whatever. I don't know. So anyway, he said, we're going to run the trip anyway, I think this year, tied to the Spokane section meeting. And so if you want to go out and see these places, Jim has all sorts of detailed latitude and longitude for each of these spots. And come on, there's a ton there. So you can, if the Columbia River Gorge is a key area of interest for you geologically already, and that's why you're here, and you want to learn more, and maybe you felt like that interview wasn't detailed enough for the gorge, there's 400 pages waiting for you written by Jim O'Connor himself for you to dive into with all sorts of specific detail. Thanks again to Jim. The slides will help me remember what I wanted to share with you now with me saying that I was feeling like I just cannot cram everything into these shows. All sorts of amazing stuff. I was asking in the last show for photos of the gorge back in the golden days of when it was accessible or available only by rail versus other things. And you're like, hey, I sent that one. How come you're not going to mention my name? I'm sorry, too many. This may be Ken from Sandpoint, Idaho, was very busy, but probably from a bunch others as well. So here's the Sunday Oregonian, September 28th, 1919, and nice little Sunday piece about getting along the new highway in the Columbia River Gorge beyond Hood River in a Chevrolet. And photos from somebody else. You can imagine the excitement, these new contraptions in 1915, and we can actually go out there with our family. We don't have to take the train anymore. We can drive ourselves on this brand new road going through this gorge with all these beautiful bridges and other things. This is up looking east at Crown Point. Crown Point's where the Vista House is, right? This is such a distinctive shot with such a very specific, detailed little thing. Is anybody interested in going up and doing a repeat photo of this? That'd be kind of fun. Like, does it still look as fresh as this? When they just, the cement's probably still warm putting this in. Email from Sean. Hi, Nick. My wife worked as a graphic artist for the Oregon Department of Transportation and retired 7 years ago. In preparation for the centennial and reopening of the highway, she colorized a number of the original glass slides. The only thing she asks is that you credit ODOT as they are the owners of the slides, but they are in public domain, so there's no issue with nonprofit use. Thank you, Sean, and your spouse. I think this is Rowena, one of my favorite places in the gorge, but I don't know the gorge that well. Major parts of this old highway are waiting for you. This is all by viewer email. I'm doing what I was hoping to do here to wrap up. I asked for some beautiful photos of the old days, and here are these original old black and white photos that are colored by Sean's spouse. Okay, our friends Salisbury and Chamberlain Remember, they are the main mentors of Brett's when he gets a PhD at the University of Chicago, and then suddenly they are his co-workers, his colleagues at the University of Chicago. Cleaning house here. Scraps all over the kitchen, just trying to get caught up. I found this fascinating. This was Dean. This was Dean and others as well. But Dean helped me get this old document from 1886 with Chamberlain reporting on his Western exploration in the summer and fall of 1885. And you're like, Chamberlain, we're going all the way back there? Well, I just remember Chamberlain is the mentor, one of the main mentors of Brett's. And I'm like, was Chamberlain ever out to the Puget Lowland or the Willamette Valley? And the answer is yes. What am I looking for? Here. So here's from, Brett's was born in 1882, so we're really going back. And Chamberlain is a 41-year-old guy, and he's got a kid right out of college, Salisbury, his former student at Beloit College. And Salisbury's teaching during the school year at Beloit College, and Chamberlain is about to become the president at the University of Wisconsin, but he's full-time USGS at this time, I guess. But I'm reading from this account where Chamberlain is just basically reporting to Gilbert and saying, here's what I did in the previous fiscal year. And so Salisbury and Chamberlain spent the whole month of August in the Dakotas. Speaking of chasing breadcrumbs, they're chasing the moraines and the glacial drift on the southern margin of the Canadian ice sheet through the Dakotas. And Chamberlain and Salisbury in August of, still late August, getting into early September, they're both in Yellowstone Park and they're in the base of the Tetons. And then Salisbury heads home, I suppose, to go back to teach at Beloit. Chamberlain stays out by himself and he's poking around Sky Coulee country, Flathead Lake, and Missoula, GLM. So let me read that to you. Here it is. Chamberlain, from September 9th to September 13th, I was engaged in a reconnoitering of the valley of Flathead Lake, giving attention chiefly to the extensive moraines that were formed by the glaciers issuing from the Rocky Mountains and filling the greater portion of the broad, flat-bottomed valley, a curious phenomenon consisting of a series of parallel watermarks of the nature of exceptionally slight terraces sweeping around the sides of the valley and encircling the isolated hills within it, like gigantic musical staves, also occupied a portion of my attention. And then he continues on. I think some of the narratives I read is that, like, Chamberlain saw these weird things above Missoula and then it was time for him to go home. No, he just kept going. Between September 14th and the 21st, I spent in the region of Lake Pend Oreille in northern Idaho, where decisive glacial phenomena are widely displayed. The more noteworthy objects of attention consisted of striated mountainsides bordering the lakes on the north and east and west. This is the frickin' ice dam we're talking about. The famous ice dam in northern Idaho, Lake Pend Oreille. Fucking Chamberlain is there. Sorry, Patrick. In 1885. Kootenay Pass, broad ancient river valley, to the Kootenay River and thence to British Columbia, the drift filling of this essentially abandoned valley and the great overwash stream of gravel stretching from the southern extremity of Lake Pend Oreille into the Spokane Valley, constituting the Spokane Plains and blocking back the waters from which Coeur d'Alene Lake. Why am I bothering you with this? This is a Columbia River Gorge show. I keep wondering why Chamberlain is not an outgoing supporter late in life of one of his star pupils, Brett's, especially since Chamberlain was at Glacial Lake, Missoula. He was at the ice dam in northern Idaho. As we'll read right now, he was in Puget Lowland and Willamette Valley. T.C. Chamberlain. I know it was recon, but was there a falling out between the two of them? As I mentioned before, Chamberlain doesn't exist in Brett's old man notes, except for one little story about the stolen watch, which wasn't stolen after all. Why wasn't Chamberlain a major part of Brett's life? I don't get it. Yeah, he continues on to northern Idaho. Chamberlain on solo heads to Spokane. Chamberlain for 42nd birthday, September 24th, 1885, Puget Sound in Willamette Valley. Then he jumps on a train and cruises across BC and Alberta, also looking at glacial stuff north of the border for 3 weeks in October, for goodness sake. September 24th to October 3rd, given observation in the Willamette Valley in the basin of Puget Sound. The subsequent 15 days were spent at private expense, because he was in Canada, in observations of the glacial phenomenon of British Columbia and the plains adjacent to the Canadian. All right. So there's just scraps here and there from past shows that continue to bubble up from things that people are sending me. And it may be frustrating for you that I keep going backwards, but I just think it's a blast. The Sharpie thing has just been fun. I enjoy it more than the slides, really. So I keep trying to play with these different timelines. Here's a new way to show this. Basically, Brett's is spending 7 years in Puget Lowland, more or less. And remember, he's changing status from high school teacher to grad student to University of Washington faculty member, then finally University of Chicago. So it's volatile professionally, I guess. Then he switches gears to what we are wrapping up today, which are these years between 1914 and 1922, 8 years where he's based out of the Columbia Gorge with his University of Chicago students. But there's volatility here too because of World War I. And I continue to wonder if I'm going to be able to get these notes from a grad student who has signed up to scan for us, but she's not going to get back to the University of Chicago and start that work until another week. So we're going to have to be patient and wait for these 1921 notes. And then we finally get to the official exciting stuff of Brett's in Eastern Washington. But I don't know, it feels like we've had all sorts of fun discoveries, you and I, to this point. Like, is Eastern Washington going to be a letdown? We've already done a bunch of cool stuff. I keep building it up. Maybe it will be a letdown. I don't know. I need to wrap this show up. Baraboo, every summer, every late fall. We've already seen that, Brett's. Okay, I just want to make this point. So some of you are like, let me go, let me help. And a few of you, especially Ken from Sandpoint, Idaho, but a number of others, you just started researching these names. And sent me all stuff about Carl, for instance, became a geology professor. And that's the part where I just have to draw the line. These are folks that did not come out to the Pacific Northwest. Yes, they were Brett's students, and yes, some became, according to Brett, became or married a geologist. But I thank you, but I'm just not going to use it. Sorry, I feel bad, but I have to find some through. So all these fascinating themes about photos of some of these students of Brett's then enlisting and going to the European Theater in 1917. This was one of Brett's students, Jeremy, if I forgot the last name. Here's Grandpa Clyde that I introduced you to last time, Clyde Zoya, the football player at Notre Dame. He enlisted. He didn't go over to Europe. The Armistice Day happened before he got sent over, but it's that same vintage. So yes, we are officially wrapping up this series, even though we're not wrapping up the series. We're wrapping up this section of the series where we are leaving the gorge. And I'm excited to get to Spokane at the next episode and get into the high school stuff and get into Brett's doing his most famous work. And yet I have kind of a weird feeling also because there's all this detailed notebook stuff, as Jim was saying, from 1919, 1920, and then when we finally get it, 1921, that I've barely looked at. And I'm just going to have to get used to that because all these details, which are exciting, are way more than we can handle with the remaining letters that we have. I'm still kind of actually struggling how I'm going to do these shows and how deep do I go in certain places when I know that there's way more that I could possibly do. Plus we have guests lined up. It's a good problem to have, but it's kind of a problem. I'm a little bit paralyzed on how I know what I'm doing this coming Thursday, but beyond that, I don't know quite how I'm going to do it. We'll figure it out. So yes, what else is here? Oh yeah, so the train folks are back. Grateful to you. So here's a map specifically from 1915. So we're really following Brett's now from Chicago with his University of Chicago students. They're either taking the Burlington route up the Mississippi through Wisconsin, or they're taking the train in 1915, the Northwestern route. But this is the famous Milwaukee Railroad out here. What is it called? Milwaukee, Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Pacific. No. Chicago, Milwaukee, Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Pacific. I'm screwing it up. It's just called Milwaukee Road out here. So here are all these stops. They're taking the train out. They don't have a car. And 1915. So I'm pretty sure that's the date on this map. Let me get rid of my dock, please. No. Take the train. All roads go through Spokane. And by now, the Milwaukee Road is going to be able to take Brett's through Ellensburg and basically right up my window. Milwaukee Road right out the window. But Brett's isn't interested in this. He's bringing these guys down to the gorge. And there are train stops on both sides of the river. Jim O'Connor, our guest today, is intimately familiar with all of these train stops, all of these locations, and the Oregon side as well. And all the detailed notes of Brett's notebooks from 1915. Apparently those notes exist. Did you catch it? Jim was asking the viewers for help finding more of those, I guess. Brett's notes of 1916, of 19, of 20 from the gorge. Here's one example. So I'm just grabbing one example. Remember, we're now into the newspaper clippings from Sharon. And this is the one that I did share in the last episode, Sharon finding old newspaper accounts of Brett's in the Gorge. And these are the names that I'm writing down because they are grad students. Come on. Grad students and seniors, apparently, that did come out to the Pacific Northwest. So I haven't totally given up on tracking some of these key students of Brett's, but there's no time to work on every person. So I'm going to highlight one. A bunch of you, probably 20 different emails from 20 different people saying, hey, yeah, I found stuff on Cheney. He's a well-known guy. And he's one of the two that stayed with Brett's through the September days in 1916. And here's the information on Cheney. One of Brett's 1916 students in the gorge. And Ralph passed away in 1971, died unexpectedly in Berkeley, California. And he'd been there since 1922. Paleobotany was his game. So he was a high school teacher, Cheney, in 1914, teaching at the Francis Parker School in Chicago, where he remained until 1917. However, in the summer of 1916, with funds accrued from his teaching position and with the encouragement of J. Harlan Bretz, Cheney went west to the Columbia River Gorge, where fossil plant localities had been discovered in the rock unit on the Oregon side of the gorge known as the Eagle Creek Formation. He was later to write, from that time on, I knew I was primarily interested in tertiary paleobotany. Cheney received a doctorate in 1919 from the University of Chicago with a dissertation based on his studies of the Miocene Eagle Creek flora of the Columbia River Gorge. His committee, composed of Chamberlain, Bretz, Salisbury, Weller, and Cowles. He taught geology at Iowa for a while, and then he gave map reading courses to soldiers in preparation for their overseas tour of duties in World War I. And then Marion in 20 connected with him, and then he went to Berkeley and was there the rest of his days. Also from Ken. I know we're going long, but I can't stop with this stuff. I cannot stop. So Sharon was finding newspaper articles, but this is one that Ken in Sandpoint found. And it's this field season of 1919, a big Sunday newspaper article. I barely looked at it. But in it, wait, what do I have here? Hang on. Hang on. We're about done. We're sharing stuff here. Do I have this? Okay. So I'll let me just, here's what we'll do to wrap up. Let me enlarge this as big as I can. This is the article over here. If you want to read this whole article, then just watch this in replay, pause it, read this, pause it, read this. It's got names. We got another newspaper account, this time from Ken, with more names. I'll show you the names in a second. Still going here, talking about what it's like, and people living in the gorge assume that the war is over, but people living in the gorge like, oh, here's a bunch of guys with like a rucksack. They must still be military. So they're like, feeding them and stuff. They're not saying they're geologists. They're just basically being treated like veterans. I probably said something inappropriate there, whatever. So it's a nice article, but I don't want to take the time to read the whole thing. I thought maybe I would, but we're really late. It's 11 o'clock. I got to get home. Okay, that's Joel. Okay, so we're finishing this up. I don't think I'm asking for anything necessarily, but if here's a new batch of Bretz's grad student names here in the Northwest, and I think those are some of the leads that I'll be able to, maybe I'll find another Cheney or two from some of you who feel like you want to do the work. Okay, so Docky. So we've already looked at this one. That's 1916. Why can't we get this? Here's Sharon from Malaga. 1919. And that's the newspaper account we were just looking at. So most of the students with Brett's in 1919, and they climbed Mount Adams in 1919, most of them were just discharged from the Army. The war is over. And I had something from Sharon, but it was just a brief thing. So this is from Ken, and we've got these names now. So I said Lieutenant Rennick and Lieutenant Curtis. Curtis saw action in France, and he said he got into some hairy spots on top of Mount Adams, which were much hairier than his time in France on the battlefield. There's 13 of these guys in the party. They all kind of congregate in downtown Portland. But we're back to the football players again. J.C. Reber was a football player for University of Chicago, possibly knew my grandpa. R.P. Gordon, they nicknamed him Tiny because he weighed 260. I guess you can nickname me Tiny as well if you like then, if that's the case. So there are some names. Don't know if you want to play along and look into that. Since we're trying to wrap up our time in the gorge with what we know, here's Sharon from 1920. Yep. Another year, more grad students. Don't know how much we will run with this. I don't know my Google Earth by Glenn well enough to know where these guys are. Is this the summer they go up the John Day? I kind of forget. But possibly Barry and Long are the two grad students. By the time we get to the 20s in the next show and beyond, Brett's has like 2 or 3 grad students typically with him, I think. That's his working number. And that was really ultimately what I was imagining, like 2 or 3 grad students who are like working for a month with Brett's in Eastern Washington. Like, what is the story with those guys? Well, this is a little different. It's a little different that we have a couple of grad students who kind of qualify, but they're mostly in the gorge, I guess. And then there's these undergrads, these football players. Feeney was on the football team. Here's the, whoa. Is that the same name? Oh, Reber came out twice. The center on the football team came out twice. Reber in 1919, Reber in 1920. Well, maybe he was a grad student as well as a football player. I don't know. In this article in 1920, Howard Sloan is like slamming the prior classes, saying that, you know, we figured out way more than those prior classes did. 1920. And then we're going to finish with this, I promise. If you know the main Brett story that's been told a bunch of times, I'll look at the live chat. Who is the arch enemy of J. Harlan Brett's in the 1930s? If you know the story, and you know that Brett's has major pushback from the USGS. Now, today, thankfully, was not an ambush meeting. But that was the 1920s. Who in the 1930s, after Brett just gave up and said, I'm going back to the Midwest, I'm going to start looking at caves. Who in the 1930s was out here publishing paper after paper and saying Brett's was wrong? Flint, you got it. Matena. Richard Foster Flint. And Jim O'Connor mentioned Flint at the beginning of today. Flint was the mentor of Porter, and Porter was the mentor of our guest today, Jim O'Connor. Well, I guess I didn't know, or if I did, I'd forgotten, that the arch enemy of J. Harlan Brett's, Richard Foster Flint, in the 1930s, was one of Brett's grad students at the University of Chicago, and Flint was out here with Brett's He's learning from Brett's. And somewhere along the line, things got a little ugly between the two of them. Was it that summer? So that's one of the many reasons I want to get those field notes of 1921, because this is the summer that Richard Foster Flint, who's apparently 23 years old or whatever, I don't know, he's with Brett's. 12 students. Where did they go? This is the only, so between O'Connor and anybody else who studies this stuff, I think this is, well, maybe you guys will come through, but besides the notes of 1921 that I'm going to get scanned at the University of Chicago before the end of the month, besides those notes of 1921, I think Sharon's newspaper article is the only thing, the only proof we have that they were really out here in 1921. So because this is the only thing we have, and these are the names that we have, let's read it as a little taste of what maybe we can really expand on in the next few weeks. Mount Adams to be scaled. Chicago students to make study of eruptions. Again, the newspaper accounts have no idea what's going on. They know nothing about the SATSUP or the submergence or anything else. They just, oh, there's a volcano, and this guy's talking about a volcano. Hood River, Oregon, August 14th, 1921. A party of University of Chicago students of geology, which for several weeks have been in the mid-Columbia, engaged in a survey of the Oregon and Washington sides of the Columbia Gorge, will leave tomorrow for an ascent of Mount Adams. The young men in charge of Professor Bretz, who was for several years has been director of investigations of groups of Chicago students in the Columbia River District, had planned to ascend Mount St. Helens. They substituted Mount Adams, however, on learning of the internal disturbances there this spring. So St. Helens was waking up in the spring of 1921. That's news to me. Can we find more about that? The Washington Peak displayed signs of eruption of mud in June. Holy shit. Okay. Sorry, Patrick. Flows streaked to the snowfields in wide expanse on both north and southeast sides of the peak. I guess they're still talking about St. Helens. The party of young geologists and their leader will make a close inspection of the mud flows of Mount Adams, and they expect to return to Hood River the later part of next week. And there are the names. So, we're done today. Thank you for joining us. What comes next? Joseph Pardee, Thomas Large, Joseph McMacken, Alonzo Troth will be our characters this coming Thursday. And I have a lot of work to do between now and Thursday, because there has been hundreds of emails coming from Jody and other viewers who have been going through document after document in Eugene, Oregon, the Thomas Large collection. And so speaking of paring things down, I have to go through all that stuff and figure out the best of the best to share with you. But we'll do proper thanks to the Eugene team of viewers, strangers before getting together over the Christmas break, but working collaboratively in these quiet reading rooms with all the students gone from the University of Oregon. Amazing, amazing, amazing. A toast to you. Is this a record? My iPad's down to 30% battery. It probably is. Here's to you for joining us today. Here's to your health here early in 2024. Here's to the microphone, which apparently is working properly today. of course, here's to our guest today, Jim O'Connor from the United States Geological Survey. Really enjoyed that, Jim. Thank you. Here's to everyone in your community, near and far, their health and their well-being, showing affection for each other in all sorts of forms. What? And a special thanks to all of you viewers like you, who are part of this series. I think this is the first time we've had a guest specifically talking about you, the viewers, and how valuable your efforts have been to this point. And there's no reason to think that's going to stop. We're just going to get more and more viewer engagement, and we're going to continue to find things that are potentially part of these open questions that we have here in 2024. Thank you, viewers. I don't think I need to, but I will anyway. A reminder that we do these live every Thursday at noon and every Sunday morning at 9 a.m. And that means that our next episode will be episode O on Thursday, January 11th at noon Pacific time. Hope that you can join us then. It'll be a solo show. I think the next two shows are going to be solo shows because there's going to be so much that we have to lay out for J. Harlan Bretz in 1922 and 1923, based out of Spokane, Washington, USA. Thank you, everybody. I love you. And goodbye from Ellensburg, Washington, USA. Goodbye. See you on Thursday. Whoo, baby. Oh, why not? Oh, that's not good enough. How do we do the balloons? Oh, yeah. Oh, that's confetti. Balloons.